When the cataclysm of the First World War engulfed Europe, he did not hide behind the safety of his title. He went straight to the mud and blood of the front lines. He lived in the trenches, suffered wounds alongside his men, and earned the Pour le Mérite with oak leaves, Prussia's highest military honor, not as a royal gift, but as a soldier's due. In an era teeming with ceremonial figureheads, he was the genuine article. But when the German Empire collapsed in 1918 and the glitter of the monarchy was swept away, his destiny twisted into a grotesque paradox. The war hero found himself standing in the dock of a Weimar Republic court, convicted of a common criminal offense, the fraudulent transfer of over 300,000 marks. Even more shocking was the public disintegration of his private life. His 20-year royal marriage was dissected in a humiliating divorce trial that exposed his wife's pre-war adultery to the world, turning a personal tragedy into a global scandal. From the commander of the elite First Foot Guards to a convicted divorcee in a crumbling society, he died quietly in Potsdam in 1942, a ghost of a bygone era. How did the empire's most valiant son end up as a defendant in a criminal court? To understand this tragic fall, we must go back to the beginning, peeling away the layers of gold braid and velvet to find the man hidden beneath the uniform. On July 7, 1883, a cry rang out through the Marmorpalais, the Marble Palace in Potsdam. It was the second son of Prince Wilhelm, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Augusta Victoria. They named him Eitel Friedrich. From the moment he drew his first breath, the weight of the House of Hohenzollern was placed upon his shoulders. This was no ordinary family. It was the beating heart of Prussian militarism, a dynasty where male children were not merely raised, but forged. They were destined from the cradle to be officers, leaders, and symbols of the state. His childhood in the new palace was a tableau of opulence on the surface, but underneath it was a world governed by rigid discipline and icy protocol. In this environment, the display of emotion was considered a weakness, a flaw in the armor. Duty and honor were the only currencies that mattered. As he grew from a boy into a young man, Eitel was sent away from the comforts of home to Plön Castle in Schleswig-Holstein. It was ostensibly a school, but in reality, it was the Prinzenhaus, a cadet academy designed to strip away the softness of youth and replace it with the steel of a Prussian officer. Isolated from the outside world, he and his brothers were denied the freedoms that ordinary children took for granted. Their days were regimented from dawn until dusk, drilling on the parade ground, studying military history, and mastering foreign languages. The warm embrace of a mother was replaced by the barking orders of drill instructors. It was a process of manufacturing a human weapon, and Eitel endured it with a stoic silence. Physically, he was the most imposing of the brothers, robust and athletic, possessing a natural aptitude for the soldier's life. Perhaps even then, he understood that the path of the sword was the only road open to him. On July 21st, 1901, at the age of 18, Eitel Friedrich was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. This was not just any military unit. It was the legendary regiment stationed in Potsdam, the direct descendants of the giant guard of Frederick the Great. Admission was restricted to the tallest, strongest, and most noble sons of the empire. When these soldiers, towering over 6 feet tall, marched in their silver helmets and blue tunics, they were the physical embodiment of German might. For Eitel, donning this uniform meant he had passed his rite of passage. He was now a man of the Hohenzollern line. He paraded through the streets of Potsdam, his chest swelling with pride. a living symbol of a future that seemed bright and unbreakable. His military career advanced with the smoothness of a well-oiled machine. Aided by his royal status but sustained by his own competence, he rose quickly through the ranks to lieutenant and then captain. He held honorary commissions in Saxon and Austrian units, expanding his influence across the Germanic world. He was a soldier to his core. He loved the order of the barracks. He did not shy away from the dust of the training grounds, and he possessed an instinctive ability to command respect from his subordinates. Yet behind the polished buttons and the ceremonial swords, a hollow emptiness began to grow. He was a perfect cog in a magnificent machine, but the man, Eitel Friedrich, the human being, was starving. To fill this void and to satisfy the dynastic demands of his father, the empire imposed upon him another duty: marriage. On February 27, 1906, Berlin erupted in celebration. It was the wedding day of Prince Eitel Friedrich and Duchess Sophie Charlotte of Oldenburg. To the public, it was a fairy tale come to life. A dashing prince and a beautiful, elegant duchess uniting two noble houses. But behind the cheering crowds and the thundering cannon salutes, the air between the bride and groom was thick with an awkward chill. This was not a union of hearts, it was a strategic alliance, a cold calculation of genealogy and politics. As they stood at the altar, the fairy tale was already showing cracks. The marriage was a disaster from the start. They were incompatible in every conceivable way. Eitel was a soldier through and through, blunt, uncomplicated, and married to his duty. Sophie was a woman of sensitivity, intellect, and romantic yearning. She found her husband's gruff demeanor and barrack-room lifestyle suffocating, while he found her emotional demands baffling. The silence in their home was deafening. Worse still, there were no children. In a royal house where producing an heir was a primary obligation, this failure placed an immense psychological burden on Sophie. Whispers began to circulate through the salons of Berlin. Rumors flew that the prince preferred the company of his regiment to his wife, and that the duchess was often seen weeping in the gardens of Bellevue Palace. As the years ground on, the foundation of their life together crumbled. Eitel retreated further into his military duties, finding solace in the predictable rigor of army life. The parade ground became his sanctuary, the only place where he felt truly in control. Sophie, abandoned emotionally and physically, began to look elsewhere for the affection she was denied. As her husband spent weeks away on maneuvers, the shadows of other men began to lengthen around her. It was during these lonely pre-war years that she crossed paths with Baron Hubertus von Plettenberg. He was ironically a former officer of the guards like Eitel, but he possessed the charm and tenderness the prince lacked. Sophie found in him a dangerous comfort, and a clandestine affair began, a secret that would eventually explode, destroying reputations and shattering the dignity of the royal house. By 1913, the atmosphere in Europe had turned toxic. The powder keg in the Balkans was sparking, and the great powers were arming themselves with a feverish intensity. The air in Berlin was heavy with impending doom. Eitel Friedrich, with his soldier's instinct, felt the war coming, and in a dark twist of fate, part of him welcomed it. War offered a legitimate escape from the suffocating failure of his marriage and the rigid expectations of the court. It offered a chance to do the one thing he was truly trained for: to fight. He threw himself into reviewing operational plans and inspecting his troops, waiting for the signal. In the summer of 1914, the shots fired in Sarajevo detonated the world. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke set the dominoes falling, and one by one, the nations of Europe declared war. The German Empire mobilized. The parade grounds of Potsdam, usually the site of ceremonial pomp, were now filled with thousands of men preparing for slaughter. Prince Eitel Friedrich stood at the head of the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. He had traded his gala uniform for field gray. His eyes, usually guarded, burned with a fierce resolve. The soldiers looked up to him, emboldened by the fact that the Kaiser's own son would be leading them into the fire, not watching from a palace balcony. "We'll be home before the leaves fall," they said, repeating the optimistic lie of the day. But looking into the steel-gray eyes of his men, Eitel perhaps sensed that the world they knew was ending. On the day of his departure, Sophie Charlotte came to see him off. The farewell was stark, devoid of the tearful passion one might expect. Eitel gave a stiff bow. Sophie watched him with a gaze that held more relief than sorrow. For her, his departure meant the removal of a watchful eye, a freedom to pursue her own life amidst the chaos. The war had physically and psychologically severed the last threads of their union. As Eitel boarded the train that would take him to the Western Front, he left behind the glittering, deceptive world of the court. The train chugged out of the station carrying the cheers of the delusional crowds who thought war was a glorious adventure. Eitel Friedrich stared out the window as the peaceful German countryside rolled by. Did he believe he would return a celebrated hero, the savior of the fatherland? Or did he feel the cold breath of the future on his neck, a future of mud, defeat, and disgrace? He could not know it then, but the moment he left Potsdam, his life as a prince was effectively over. Ahead of him lay the trenches of France, the frozen plains of Russia, and a descent into a new, harsh reality where the name Hohenzollern would offer no protection. The music of the military bands faded into the distance, and the train sped into the darkness, carrying the prince toward the abyss of the 20th century. The train that had carried Prince Eitel Friedrich out of Potsdam did not just transport him across a geographical border, it ferried him across a temporal one, leaving the 19th century behind and plunging him headlong into the mechanized slaughterhouse of the 20th. The optimistic songs of the soldiers, fueled by schnapps and propaganda, died in their throats the moment the doors opened in France. The air did not smell of summer hay or French perfume. It smelled of cordite, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of blood. The war was not a sport, and the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, those giants who had looked so invincible on the parade grounds of Berlin, were about to discover that modern machine guns did not discriminate between a peasant and a prince, nor did they care for the height or pedigree of a soldier. When the 1st Foot Guards engaged at the Battle of St. Quentin in late August 1914, the reality of the conflict crashed down upon Eitel Friedrich with the force of a physical blow. The tactics he had studied at the military academy, the sweeping charges, the glorious maneuvering of cavalry, the gentlemanly clash of arms, were rendered obsolete in seconds. He watched as the flower of Prussian nobility, young men he had dined with and drilled with, were cut down like wheat by invisible scythes. The blue tunics that had looked so splendid in the sunlight became targets. The silver helmets, symbols of Frederick the Great's legacy, were merely beacons for French sharpshooters. In the chaos of the Sambre, the prince was not a royal highness, he was a target. Yet it was here, amidst the screaming shells and the shredding of human flesh, that the caricature of the pampered royal began to dissolve, revealing the steel frame of the man beneath. He did not command from a chateau in the rear. He was there, in the dirt, his boots caked with the same mud that swallowed his men. He moved along the lines, his tall frame making him a conspicuous target, shouting encouragement, rallying the wavering lines and witnessing the carnage firsthand. But bravery is no shield against shrapnel. In the fierce fighting near Bapaume in the autumn of 1914, The war came for him personally. A shell exploded nearby, and the prince went down. It was not a scratch or a graze suitable for a propaganda photo. It was a serious wound that tore into his leg. The pain was blinding, a white-hot, searing agony that stripped away all titles and left only a frightened, wounded man. For a moment, as he was carried off the field on a stretcher bleeding and pale, the soldiers watching might have thought this was the end of his war. Surely, the Kaiser's son would be evacuated to a private sanitarium, pinned with a medal, and kept safe for the duration of the conflict. It would have been the expected path. He handed over command of the regiment to Count Hans-Jürgen von Blumenthal, and the stretcher-bearers hurried him away from the inferno. But Eitel Friedrich was possessed of a stubborn, almost masochistic resilience. He refused to let the wound sever his connection to the front. While recovering, he did not bask in the comfort of the rear. He agitated for his return. He felt a profound, almost spiritual tether to his men. They were dying for his father's empire, and he could not sit in a hospital bed while they rotted in the trenches. By the end of the year, limping but unbowed, he was back. 1915 brought a change of scenery, but no respite from the violence. The war on the Western Front had congealed into a stalemate of barbed wire and stagnation, so the German High Command looked east. Eitel Friedrich was transferred to the Eastern Front, a theater of war that was vast, brutal, and terrifyingly mobile. Here, the enemy was the Russian Empire, the steamroller that threatened to crush Germany from the Urals. The prince was given command of the 1st Guards Infantry Brigade, and later the 1st Guards Division. If the West was a meat grinder, the East was a furnace. The landscapes were endless, the cold was biting, and the scale of the maneuvers was exhausting. It was during the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive that Eitel proved his tactical acumen. This was not a sit-and-wait war. It was a war of movement, of breaking lines and chasing the enemy across the Galician plains. He led his division through the fire, playing a crucial role in the recapture of Lemberg. He was constantly on the move, his headquarters often nothing more than a tent or a ruined farmhouse close to the fighting. He saw the devastation of the Polish countryside, the burning villages, and the streams of refugees, but his focus remained singular: victory. It was in the East that he earned the respect of the common soldier, not because of who his father was, but because he shared their lice, their cold, and their danger. In the summer of 1915, amidst the sweeping chaos of the Eastern Front, an incident occurred that would become legendary, though it was largely hidden from the history books for decades. It was a moment that felt ripped from an adventure novel, a collision of two German legends before they were legends. A German aircraft, scouting the Russian lines, suffered a catastrophic engine failure and plummeted from the sky, crashing into a dense dark forest in a contested no man's land. The pilot and his observer crawled from the wreckage, bruised and shaken, terrified that the approaching footsteps crunching through the undergrowth belonged to Russian Cossacks, known for giving no quarter. They hid in the bushes, clutching their service pistols, ready to sell their lives dearly. When the soldiers emerged from the trees, they wore field gray, not Russian khaki. And leading them was a tall, imposing figure with the distinctive profile of the Hohenzollerns. It was Prince Eitel Friedrich. He had seen the plane go down and had personally led a patrol of his guardsmen into the dangerous territory to rescue the airmen. The pilot he pulled from the wreckage was a young cavalry officer turned aviator named Manfred von Richthofen. The prince had just saved the life of the man who would go on to become the Red Baron, the deadliest ace of the war. They exchanged salutes in the clearing. The Prince of the Blood and the future Prince of the Air, a fleeting intersection of destinies amidst the carnage. Eitel ensured the men were fed and returned to their unit, a gesture of camaraderie that Richthofen would never forget. His leadership did not go unrecognized. On March 22, 1915, he received the telegram that every Prussian officer dreamed of. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, Prussia's highest order for military merit. But for Eitel, the medal was heavy. It hung around his neck not as a piece of jewelry, but as a gravestone for the thousands of men he had lost to earn it. The citation spoke of his bravery, his storming of the heights, and his unshakable coolness under fire. 2 months later, on May 14th, the oak leaves were added to the cross, a distinction reserved for only the most successful commanders. Critics in the rear might have whispered of nepotism, but the men in the shell holes knew better. You cannot fake courage when the artillery is falling. You cannot fake the limp from a shrapnel wound. The oak leaves were real because the blood he had shed was real. As the war dragged on into 1916 and 1917, the initial fervor of patriotism ground down into a grim determination to survive. Eitel was transferred back to the Western Front to the hellscapes of the Somme and the Chemin des Dames. The war had changed again. It was no longer about movement. It was about industrial attrition. It was a mathematical equation of death. How many tons of high explosive were needed to pulverize a square mile of earth? How many bodies were needed to fill a trench? Eitel watched as the quality of his troops declined. The giants of 1914 were dead. In their place were thin, hungry boys of 18 and tired men of 40. The blockade was starving Germany. The supplies were dwindling, the horses were dying, and the letters from home spoke of turnip soup and bread lines. Throughout this long nightmare, Eitel Friedrich remained a constant presence. He became a father figure to his division, a stern but reliable anchor in a world that was disintegrating. But while he was fighting the enemies of the fatherland, a different kind of silence was growing from Berlin. His letters to Sophie Charlotte were brief, dutiful, and increasingly hollow. He received little news from her that offered comfort. He did not know, or perhaps refused to let himself know, that while he was sleeping in dugouts with rats running over his boots, his wife was navigating the gray moral landscape of a capital city at war, finding solace in arms that were not his. The disconnect was total. He was living in a world of black and white, life and death. She was living in a world of gray, of survival and loneliness. The war was preserving his honor as a soldier, but it was rotting the foundations of his life as a man. By 1918, the end was approaching with the inevitability of a setting sun. The spring offensive, the last desperate gamble of the German army, had failed. The Americans were pouring into the line, fresh and well-fed, while Eitel's men were gaunt scarecrows in patched uniforms. The retreat began. It was a slow fighting withdrawal, a bitter pill for a man raised on the legends of Prussian invincibility. He watched the territory they had paid for, with rivers of blood, be given back, mile by bloody mile. The discipline in other units began to crack. Red flags appeared on trains, and talk of revolution drifted from the rear. But Eitel's division held. They held because of him. He was the last vestige of the old order, standing firm as the dam broke. Then came November. The news hit the front like a physical blow, harder than any shell. The Kaiser had abdicated. The Republic had been proclaimed, the war was over, and they had lost. The world Eitel Friedrich had been born to rule, the world he had fought for 4 agonizing years to protect, had simply ceased to exist. He stood before his troops, the oak leaves at his throat, now a symbol of a defunct empire, and wept. Not for himself, but for the futility of it all. He had led them into hell, and now there was no heaven to return to. There was only a broken country, a hostile peace, and a long gray road back to a home that was no longer his. He stripped the royal insignia from his uniform, but he could not strip the identity from his soul. He marched his men back to Germany in good order, refusing to let them dissolve into a rabble. But as he crossed the border, he was no longer Prince Eitel Friedrich, son of the All-Highest. He was just a citizen in a defeated land, a man with a shattered leg and a shattered heart, walking into a storm that would prove far more treacherous than the shrapnel of Bapaume. The guns had fallen silent, but the war for his survival and his dignity was only just beginning. The march back to Potsdam in December 1918 was a funeral procession for an empire that had already died. Prince Eitel Friedrich rode at the head of his division, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. The streets of the towns they passed through were gray and sullen. There were no flowers, no cheering maidens, no ringing church bells. Instead, there were the cold stares of a population starved by the blockade and disillusioned by defeat. Red flags, the symbols of the revolution that had toppled his father's throne, fluttered from town halls and railway stations. Every flapping piece of crimson cloth was a stinging reminder that the world had inverted. The officers rode with their eyes fixed forward, jaws set in grim lines, trying to maintain a semblance of dignity in the face of a nation that had turned its back on them. When they finally reached the gates of Berlin, the reception was a chaotic mix of relief and hostility. The new socialist government, terrified of the Bolshevik chaos that had consumed Russia, needed the army to maintain order, yet they despised what the army represented. Eitel Friedrich, the son of the reviled Kaiser, was a lightning rod. As he disbanded his troops, saying farewell to men he had led through the fires of the Somme and the frozen wastes of Russia, he felt a profound sense of amputation. These men were his family, his purpose. Without them, stripped of his command, he was merely a man in a coat, standing in the ruins of a dynasty. He retreated to Villa Ingenheim in Potsdam, his private residence. It was a beautiful neoclassical building, but in the winter of 1918, it felt like a mausoleum. The silence of the house was more unnerving than the roar of the artillery. His father, the Kaiser, was chopping wood in exile in Doorn, the Netherlands, a fallen figure of ridicule. His mother, the Empress, was broken in spirit and failing in health. Eitel Friedrich remained. He did not flee. He stayed behind to act as the steward of the Hohenzollern interests, a captain refusing to leave the sinking ship even after the water had reached the bridge. But the Germany he remained in was alien to him. The aristocracy was stripping off their titles to blend in. The social order was dissolving. Inside the Villa Ingenheim, another war was being waged, a silent, suffocating war of attrition between husband and wife. The reunion with Sophie Charlotte was a masterpiece of aristocratic pretense. They dined at opposite ends of a long table, the clinking of silverware, the only interruption to the heavy silence. The war had provided a convenient excuse for their separation. Peace removed that buffer. Eitel looked at Sophie and saw a stranger, a woman whose heart had long since migrated elsewhere. Sophie looked at Eitel and saw a broken relic of a system she had never truly fit into. They were two ghosts haunting the same hallway, bound by a marriage contract that was now politically meaningless but socially binding. The tension was palpable, a thick fog of resentment and unspoken accusations. He knew, or at least suspected, that she had not been pining for him during those 4 years. The rumors had reached even the trenches, whispered by aides and hinted at in letters from friends. But in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, they maintained the facade. The Hohenzollerns had lost the throne. They could not afford to lose their dignity too. desperate for a sense of purpose and a connection to the only reality that made sense to him, the camaraderie of the front. Eitel threw himself into the burgeoning veterans' movements. He could not accept the Weimar Republic. To him, it was a government of traitors, born from a stab in the back that had betrayed the undefeated army in the field. This myth, however false, was the oxygen that kept men like Eitel alive. He joined Der Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet, a paramilitary organization of frontline soldiers. It was not just a club, it was a sanctuary. Here, among the smell of stale tobacco and the clinking of beer steins, he was still the prince. He was still the commander. They spoke the same language, the language of the trenches, which the civilians outside could never understand. In the smoky halls of the Stahlhelm meetings, Eitel found a new mission. They marched in the streets, their boots hammering out a rhythm of defiance against the fragile republic. They wore their field gray uniforms, stripped of imperial insignia, but heavy with meaning. Eitel became a figurehead for the monarchist cause, a rallying point for those who dreamed of a restoration. He believed, with a naive but fierce intensity, that this Republican experiment was a temporary madness, a fever that would break, allowing the rightful order to return. He did not see that he was being used, that the hardliners and the rising extremists were using his name and his prestige to lend legitimacy to their violence, while he, the honorable soldier, thought he was merely upholding tradition. But while he marched with the Stahlhelm, a more insidious threat was closing in. The economic foundations of Germany were cracking, the currency was unstable, and the vast wealth of the Hohenzollern family was under threat of sequestration by the socialist government. There was a panic among the old elite, a terrifying fear that they would be left destitute, stripped of their estates and their fortunes, like the Romanovs in Russia. It was in this atmosphere of financial hysteria that Eitel Friedrich made a fatal error in judgment. It was not an act of malice, but an act of desperate preservation. Charged with managing the family's finances and fearing that the government would seize their liquid assets, he attempted to move capital to safety. He authorized the transfer of 300,000 marks to the Netherlands, ostensibly to support his exiled relatives, or, as he would later claim, to secure a settlement for his wife. In the old days, a prince moving money was a matter of state. In the Weimar Republic, it was a violation of the strict new laws against capital flight. He did not realize that the rules had changed, that the law was now a weapon that could be used against him. He was operating with the mindset of a prince who was above the bureaucracy, not realizing that the bureaucracy was now the master. The transaction was flagged. The new republic, eager to demonstrate that no one was above the law, and perhaps eager to humiliate the symbol of the old regime, pounced. An investigation was opened. For the first time in the history of Prussia, a son of the Kaiser was summoned not to a throne room, but to an interrogation room. The humiliation was absolute. The police, men who just a few years ago would have snapped to attention as his carriage passed, now questioned him with an insolent casualness. They dug into his accounts, his correspondence, and his motives. The press, freed from imperial censorship and hungry for scandal, caught the scent of blood. Hohenzollern prince smuggles millions, the headline screamed, exaggerating the sums and twisting the intent. Eitel felt the walls closing in. He was fighting on two fronts: the public front, where he was being painted as a greedy aristocrat trying to loot the dying nation, and the private front, where his marriage was finally irrevocably disintegrating. Sophie Charlotte, sensing the ship was going down, began to distance herself. The protection of the royal name was fading. Being the wife of Eitel Friedrich was no longer a shield but a liability. The whispers about Baron von Plettenberg grew louder. no longer confined to the salons but leaking into the legal briefs. As 1920 bled into 1921, the stage was set for a public crucifixion. The hero of the Pour le Mérite was about to be put on display. He had survived the artillery of the Entente, but he was unprepared for the artillery of the courtroom. He sat in his study at Villa Ingenheim, watching the rain streak the windows, the Pour le Mérite gathering dust in a velvet box on his desk. He realized with a sinking heart that the bravery required to charge a machine gun nest was entirely different from the bravery required to sit in a defendant's chair while common lawyers tore apart your character. The tragedy of his life was shifting genres, from a war epic to a sordid courtroom drama, and the public, angry, hungry, and looking for a scapegoat for their own suffering, was waiting for the show to begin. The year 1921 did not dawn with hope. It broke like a fever. The Berlin Moabite Criminal Court was a grim, imposing edifice, a fortress of red brick and cold stone that seemed to frown upon the city. In the days of the Empire, a man like Prince Eitel Friedrich would have never set foot here unless he was inspecting it. Now, he was walking up its steps not as a patron, but as the accused. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric, with a morbid curiosity. The crowds that gathered were not the cheering subjects of 1914, nor were they the silent, respectful mourners of the monarchy. They were a mixture of the hungry, the angry, and the cynical, the proletariat of the Weimar Republic who had come to see a Hohenzollern bleed, not real blood, but dignity. Entering the courtroom was a visceral shock. The air smelled of stale tobacco smoke, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of petty criminals. Eitel Friedrich, tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a civilian suit that fit him like armor, looked woefully out of place. He moved with the stiff, disciplined gait of a Prussian guardsman, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. He was the son of the All-Highest. He had commanded divisions. He had held the line at the Somme. And yet here he was, sandwiched between dockets for pickpockets and burglars, waiting for a judge, a common civil servant, to decide his fate. The charge was dry, bureaucratic, and utterly humiliating. Violation of the capital flight laws. The accusation was that he had attempted to smuggle 330,000 marks out of Germany to the Netherlands. The prosecutor, a man representing the new Republican order, did not treat him with the deference of the past. He painted the prince not as a concerned husband trying to secure a future for his family, but as a rat deserting a sinking ship, hoarding wealth while the German people lined up for bread. Eitel sat in the dock, his jaw set, listening to the legal arguments that reduced his life to columns of figures and banking regulations. When he took the stand, he tried to explain. His voice, accustomed to shouting orders over the roar of artillery, echoed strangely in the wood-paneled room. He argued that the money was not for himself. It was a settlement, a necessary provision for his wife, Duchess Sophie Charlotte. He claimed he was merely acting as a responsible head of the household, ensuring that the women of the family would not be destitute in these uncertain times. It was a defense rooted in the old code of chivalry, where a prince provided and protected. But the court was operating under the new code of the Republic, where such actions were simply illegal currency manipulation. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The judge imposed a fine of 5,000 marks. It was a paltry sum for a man of his background, a mere slap on the wrist financially, but the moral cost was incalculable. The gavel that banged down did not just signal a fine, it signaled the criminalization of the old elite. The headlines the next day were merciless. Prince Eitel Friedrich, smuggler, the Hohenzollern greed. The socialist newspapers, particularly Vorwärts, flayed him alive. They juxtaposed the image of the suffering war invalid begging on the street corner with the image of the wealthy prince trying to funnel fortune abroad. The narrative of the hero of the front was being systematically dismantled, brick by brick, replaced by the caricature of the parasitic royal. He returned to his estate in Potsdam, but found no sanctuary within its walls. The fine had been paid, but the shame lingered like a foul odor. Yet the financial scandal was merely the overture to a far more devastating symphony of destruction. The defense he had used in court, that the money was for his wife, was a bitter irony. He was trying to secure the future of a woman who had already left him in spirit years ago. The walls of the villa, which had once concealed the icy silence of their marriage, could no longer hold back the truth. The divorce proceedings, which had been simmering in the background since 1919, now began to boil over. In the old days, a royal divorce would have been handled with the utmost discretion, a quiet annulment orchestrated by chancellors and bishops, the details buried in the state archives forever. But there was no chancellor to protect him now, and the press was free. Eitel, perhaps driven by a soldier's rigid sense of right and wrong, or perhaps blinded by wounded pride, had initiated the divorce on the grounds of Sophie's infidelity. He wanted to excise the rot from his life, to reclaim his honor. He did not realize that in doing so he was pulling the pin on a grenade in a glass house. The revelation came not as a whisper, but as a scream. Sophie Charlotte was not just a passive respondent in the divorce. She was summoned as a witness in another related case, the divorce of Baron Hubertus von Plettenberg. The intricacies of the legal system dragged the dirty laundry of the Prussian elite into the open sunlight. Sophie, standing before the court, was forced to testify under oath. The question was simple, brutal, and direct. Had she maintained intimate relations with Baron von Plettenberg? The courtroom held its breath. This was a duchess, a daughter-in-law of the Kaiser. Her answer would echo across Europe. And she answered, yes, she admitted it. She admitted that the affair had begun before the war, in those hollow years when Eitel was married to his regiment, and she was married to her loneliness. She admitted that while Eitel was bleeding in the mud of Bapaume, while he was rescuing the Red Baron in the forests of the East, she was in the arms of another man. The timeline was damning. The affair had continued through the war. The letters, the meetings, the emotional abandonment, it was all laid bare. For Eitel, this was a wound far deeper than the shrapnel in his leg. The shrapnel had only torn his flesh. This tore his reality. He had constructed a self-image based on duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. He was the faithful soldier, the stoic husband. To discover that he was, in the eyes of the public, a cuckold, a man whose wife had sought comfort with a subordinate while he fought for the survival of the nation, was a humiliation that burned hotter than fire. The press went into a frenzy. The German newspapers, still retaining a shred of deferential hesitation, or perhaps fearing libel laws, were somewhat restrained in their language. But the foreign press had no such qualms. In London, Paris, and New York, the papers screamed the scandal. The fall of the House of Hohenzollern, royal adultery exposed. They painted a picture of a degenerate, collapsing aristocracy. Eitel Friedrich became a tragicomic figure on the world stage. The British papers in particular reveled in the story, seeing it as the final moral bankruptcy of the family that had plunged the world into war. Eitel fought back with the clumsiness of a man who brings a sword to a gunfight. In 1922, he sued 2 German newspapers for libel, claiming they had grossly exaggerated the details of the affair and his wife's conduct. He was desperate to control the narrative to salvage some scrap of dignity, but the courtroom is a cruel theater. In suing for libel, he only invited more scrutiny. The defense attorneys for the newspapers argued that they had merely reported the truth, and the truth, as established by Sophie's own testimony, was on their side. He lost the public opinion war even if he won minor legal skirmishes. Every headline, every court appearance, chipped away at the statue of the hero until only the man remained, angry, lonely, and exposed. The final divorce decree, when it eventually came, was almost a formality. The court granted the separation on the grounds of Sophie's adultery. It was a legal victory for Eitel, a vindication of his claims, but it felt like a defeat. He was left alone in the Villa Ingenheim. The rooms were empty. The servants moved quietly, averting their eyes. The Pour le Mérite with oak leaves still sat in its box, but it could not comfort him. A medal honors courage in the face of the enemy, but there is no medal for enduring the collapse of one's private life. He retreated further into the only world that still accepted him, the Stahlhelm. The Veterans Organization became his surrogate family. There, among the men who had also lost everything, their health, their youth, their country, he found a twisted kind of solace. They didn't care about the 300,000 marks. They didn't care about Baron von Plettenberg. They only cared that he had stood with them when the shells were falling. He threw himself into their activities with a renewed, almost fanatical vigor. He marched, he gave speeches, he organized rallies. He tried to drown out the memory of the courtroom laughter with the sound of marching boots. But even within the right-wing circles, his star was dimming. The scandal had made him a liability. The monarchist movement needed unsullied heroes, pure symbols of the past. A convicted currency smuggler and a divorced man involved in a sordid sex scandal was difficult to market as the face of a renewed Germany. He could feel the polite distance growing between him and the other conservative leaders. He was becoming a relic, an embarrassing reminder of the messiness of the past. As the mid-1920s approached, a strange quiet settled over Eitel Friedrich's life. The storms had passed, leaving wreckage in their wake. He was no longer the dashing young prince. He was a middle-aged man, heavier, his face lined with bitterness. He walked the gardens of Sanssouci, a ghost haunting the landscape of his ancestors. He watched as the Weimar Republic, the entity he despised, stabilized for a brief, golden era. Jazz music played in the cabarets of Berlin. Women with short hair danced the Charleston. The currency stabilized. The world was moving on, accelerating away from him. He was a man of 1914 living in 1925, stranded on an island of memory. And in the distance, a new noise was rising. It was not the disciplined tramp of the Imperial Guard, nor the chaotic clamor of the revolutionaries. It was a brown tide, led by an Austrian corporal he might have once commanded. The Nazis were beginning to march, and they looked at the old aristocracy not with reverence, but with a predatory calculation. Eitel Friedrich, the fallen prince, stood at the crossroads of history, watching the shadows lengthen, unaware that the final act of his life would be played out in a darkness even deeper than the trenches. The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when the next blow landed, stripping away the last vestige of Eitel Friedrich's chivalric identity. Since 1907, he had served as the Herrenmeister, the Master of Knights, of the Order of St. John, the Johanniter Orden. This was not merely a ceremonial title. It was a sacred brotherhood of Protestant nobility, an institution that dated back to the Crusades. To be the master was to be the moral compass of the German aristocracy, a position that demanded unimpeachable character and spiritual purity. but a man who had stood in the dock for financial fraud and whose marriage had dissolved in a public spectacle of adultery was no longer fit to lead an order of Christian knights. In 1926, under immense pressure from the Council of the Order, Eitel Friedrich resigned. He handed over the mantle to his younger brother, Prince Oscar. It was a quiet, bureaucratic surrender, but for Eitel, it was the final excommunication from the world he understood. The soldier had lost his regiment, the husband had lost his wife, and now the knight had lost his crusade. He withdrew into the shadows of his private residence, living like a hermit amidst the relics of his former glory. The late 1920s in Germany were a time of frenetic energy, the golden 20s of cabaret, jazz, and artistic explosion, but Eitel lived in a sealed capsule of the past. He surrounded himself with artifacts of the empire, portraits of his father, his collection of medals, and the tattered maps of the Western Front. He grew heavier, his once athletic frame softening into the bulk of a man who no longer has a war to fight. He was only in his 40s, yet he carried himself like an old man haunted by the ghosts of the friends who had died in 1914 and the reputation that had died in 1921. Outside the gates of his villa, the political landscape was shifting with terrifying speed. The Great Depression of 1929 shattered the fragile stability of the Weimar Republic, and the streets once again filled with angry men in uniforms. But this time, the uniforms were brown. The rise of the Nazi Party presented a complex dilemma for the fallen prince. Like many conservative monarchists and members of the Stahlhelm, Eitel Friedrich initially viewed the Nazis with a mixture of disdain and opportunistic hope. He despised their vulgarity, their street-brawling tactics, and their Austrian corporal leader, whom he viewed as a social inferior. Yet, he also saw in them a force that could destroy the hated republic and perhaps, just perhaps, pave the way for a restoration of the Hohenzollern throne. It was a delusion shared by his family, a fatal miscalculation that they could ride the Nazi tiger and control it. Eitel attended Stahlhelm rallies that increasingly marched alongside the SA, the stormtroopers of the Nazi Party. In 1931, he appeared at the founding of the Harzburg Front, a coalition of right-wing groups attempting to unite against the government. There he stood, a somber figure in the background, while Adolf Hitler worked the crowd into a frenzy. Eitel was a prop, a symbol of the old legitimacy that the Nazis were eager to exploit but had no intention of respecting. He was lending his name to the grave diggers of his own class. When Hitler finally seized power in 1933, the illusion of partnership evaporated quickly. The Nazis did not want a Kaiser, they wanted a Führer. The Stahlhelm, Eitel's sanctuary, was forcibly coordinated and eventually absorbed into the SA. The monarchist dreams were suffocated. Eitel found himself in a precarious position. To the Nazis, he was a relic of a reactionary past, a man with too much baggage and too little political utility. His scandals, the fraud conviction, the divorce, made him distasteful to the moral Puritans within the Nazi hierarchy. He was pushed further to the margins, watched by the Gestapo not as a threat, but as a potential nuisance. The final decade of his life was a slow fade into obscurity. He lived quietly in Potsdam, a city that was itself a museum of Prussian glory, now draped in swastika flags. He maintained a small circle of friends, mostly old comrades from the First Foot Guards, who would visit to drink wine and reminisce about the days when honor was decided by courage, not by party loyalty. They spoke of the Battle of the Somme and the rescue of Richthofen, retelling the stories until they became polished stones of memory, shielding them from the ugly reality of the Third Reich. Eitel never joined the Nazi Party. Whether out of principle, arrogance, or simple apathy, he kept his distance. He was a man of the Second Reich, and he would not bend his knee to the Third. By 1939, the world was at war again. Eitel Friedrich watched as a new generation of German youth marched out of Potsdam. He saw the same enthusiasm in their eyes that he had seen in his own men in 1914, and he felt a sickening sense of déjà vu. But this was not his war. He was 56 years old, his body failing, his legacy tarnished. He was not asked to command. He was not asked to advise. He was merely a spectator, listening to the radio reports of victories in Poland and France, knowing that these triumphs belonged to a regime he did not understand and a leader he privately detested. The irony was bitter. The hero of the First World War was completely irrelevant in the Second. His health began to decline rapidly. The stress of the scandals, the isolation, and the sedentary life took their toll. In late 1942, as the tide of war began to turn against Germany at Stalingrad, Eitel Friedrich collapsed. It was a stroke. He was taken to his bed in the Villa Ingenheim, the house that had been his refuge and his prison. There were no dramatic last words, no state visits from the government. He lingered for a few days, drifting in and out of consciousness, perhaps wandering in his mind back to the forests of Poland or the trenches of France, back to the time when he was whole. On December 8, 1942, surrounded by a few loyal retainers, Prince Eitel Friedrich of Prussia died. He was 59 years old. The news of his death was met with an awkward silence by the Nazi regime. A Hohenzollern prince, a holder of the Pour le Mérite with oak leaves, had died. Protocol dictated a military funeral with full honors, but the Nazis were paranoid. They feared that a royal funeral would turn into a monarchist demonstration, a rallying point for those disillusioned with the grueling war. Hitler personally intervened. He issued a directive that was the final insult to the old soldier. There would be no military honors. No soldiers would line the streets. No gun carriage would bear the coffin. Officers attending were forbidden to wear their uniforms. They had to appear in civilian clothes. On December 12, 1942, the funeral took place at the antique temple in Sanssouci Park. It was a gray, freezing day. The procession was a ghostly shadow of what it should have been. Men who had charged machine gun nests with Eitel, men who had bled with him, walked behind the hearse in ill-fitting black suits and fedoras, looking like mourners at a bank clerk's funeral, rather than the brothers in arms of a royal general. The Nazi officials watched from a distance, ensuring the ban was enforced. There was no watch on the Rhine, no thunder of boots, just the shuffling of feet on the frozen gravel and the wind howling through the leafless trees. They lowered him into the crypt of the antique temple, placing him beside his ancestors. As the stone slab was slid into place, sealing him in darkness, it marked more than the death of a man. It was the burial of the Prussian tradition he represented. The values of the Pour le Mérite, individual valor, chivalry, noble obligation, had been strangled by the industrial brutality of the Nazis. Eitel Friedrich, the brave soldier and the flawed man, the hero and the convict, was left to rest in the cold earth of Potsdam, while above him the world continued to burn in a fire he had seen kindled but would not see extinguished. History is rarely kind to the losers, but it is cruelest to those who lose themselves. Eitel Friedrich's life was a perfect tragedy, a three-act play of ascent, corruption, and decay. He began as the golden son of the empire, the warrior prince who saved the Red Baron and bled for his country. He ended as a cautionary tale, a man who survived the physical war only to be destroyed by the peace. His story asks us uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism. How can the same man be a savior in the trenches and a fraud in the bank? How can a man command the loyalty of thousands but fail to hold the love of one woman? Perhaps the answer lies in the rigidity of the world he was born into. He was forged for a specific purpose: to lead, to fight, to rule. And when that purpose was removed, when the stage was dismantled, the actor did not know how to exit. He remained in character while the scenery changed around him, becoming first a nuisance, then a villain, and finally a ghost. Today, tourists wander through the park of Sanssouci, admiring the palaces and the gardens. Few stop at the antique temple. Fewer still know that inside lies a man who wore the oak leaves, who walked through the fire of the 20th century's opening act, and who died stripped of his uniform by the very forces that claimed to inherit his martial legacy. Eitel Friedrich remains there, a silent witness to the fact that medals tarnish, empires crumble, and in the end, even a prince cannot outrun his own humanity. The war ended for everyone else in 1918 or 1945, but for the lonely man in the crypt, the